Hey English 1102 friends, this is a video going through the story The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The story's under the Gothic and Grotesque module in D2L. And I want to talk just a second about how this is a sort of grotesque story. The definition of grotesque, the common accepted literary definition of grotesque, and this comes from a Georgia writer named Flannery O'Connor. And Flannery O'Connor argues in this famous essay of hers called Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction. What she says is there's really two kinds of grotesques, and this story is very clearly one of them. She says the grotesque is people behaving in extreme ways, people behaving in ways that are beyond the bounds of normal accepted human behavior, people doing extreme things. You've got this sort of spectrum of what's normal behavior you can expect from people, and what grotesque is when people act outside that normal spectrum. So it's this sort of extreme behavior, or it is normal people who would normally behave in normal ways who are put into extreme situations. People forced to react to extreme circumstances or extreme situations. Normal people who would normally not act grotesque, but they're put into grotesque situations and they're forced to react to those grotesque situations. So you get people acting in extreme ways or people forced to deal with extreme circumstances or situations. This story is much more, well, you can kind of argue both ways. I have always read this story as people behaving in extreme ways. The grotesque is coming from the people in this story. You could also argue, though, that what you're getting is this situation that happens once a year that makes these people, the circumstances of the lottery make these people who are normally normal people and acceptable people, but it makes them behave in extreme ways. The lottery makes them behave in extreme ways. You can really support either of those readings. And you can see this story is from 1948, just a few years after World War II. Shirley Jackson is most famous in American literature now for this story and for The Haunting of Hill House, her most famous novel. A lot of her writing deals with this sort of grotesque, people having to deal with extreme circumstances or people who behave in extreme ways. Her comments about this story over the years, and she never really explained this story in a lot of detail in interviews or when she talked about it, but one of the things she says is part of what is happening in this story is these people, because of the power of ritual and the power of this tradition, these people are willing to do what is objectively this horrible, horrifying, extreme thing because there's just this tradition of it, and they march blindly forward, not questioning this tradition, and just keep it going because it's the village ritual, it's tradition. And there's even a character in this story, Old Man Warner, he's 77 years old, and he's very clearly the voice of tradition and ritual, and like, don't quite, we're going to do this because we've always done it, and don't question tradition and this kind of thing. You dive into this story, and one of the things that's always interesting to me about this story is this story takes place over just a couple of hours. In like story world, the world of the story, this story takes 2, maybe 3 hours. The morning of June 27th, it starts on the morning of June 27th, and these people, by the time you get to the end of the story, they want to finish up killing this woman, and then so they can go have time for lunch. This story does not last. It lasts long. It just lasts a few hours. There is also some foreshadowing at the beginning of this story. It's the morning of June 27th. It's clear and sunny with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. You get the contrast between this sort of nice, pretty, happy summer day and what's about to happen, this really dark, awful thing. But there is also some foreshadowing. The whole lottery took only about 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. Here's the foreshadowing, though. The children assembled first, and you get it in the second paragraph. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his examples, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Eventually, they made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. And the boys all make this pile of rocks, and at first it seems like, so what? They're just piling up rocks. You know, maybe they're going to have a rock fight later or something like that. But of course, you find out at the end of this story, they made this pile of rocks as part of the ritual getting ready for the lottery, because everybody in the village is going to use these rocks later to kill whoever wins the lottery. That's also the situational irony, the contrast in this story. The situational irony is that your expectation is that winning the lottery would be a good thing. This is a story called The Lottery. We generally think of winning the lottery as good. The irony here is that you get the opposite, that it means the opposite, that winning the lottery here is not a good thing. It's the opposite. It's death. The men began to gather, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. The lottery was conducted by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. So you get this, you know, they're buying into the ritual, they're getting into the ritual. There is also this dark symbolism when Mr. Summers comes out with the box. And he brings out the box they're going to have the drawing from. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool. And when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand," there was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool. There is this, the black box has this symbolic, you know, this is where death comes from. They don't want to get too close to it. They don't really want to touch it because it has this symbolic power, because this is where death comes out of. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago. The black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Here's where Old Man Warner comes into the story. You find out he's the oldest person in town. He survived 77 of these lotteries, and he survives this one too. And every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off. Again, they don't want to mess with ritual, they don't want to mess with tradition, they don't want to question tradition. Several times in this story, you know, people are like, some people bring up the idea of quitting the lottery and say other places have quit the lottery, but it's like, no, this is tradition, this is the way we've always done things. Part of the sort of idea or trope or theme of this story is this unquestioning following of tradition, even if it doesn't make sense. In this case, the lottery is based on this idea of farming and agriculture and all this stuff, and most of these people aren't even farmers anymore, but they just keep doing this thing about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon, and all this stuff. And most of these people don't raise corn or anything like that, but they just keep doing this because they've always done it, because it's tradition and the power of tradition and the power of ritual. You get this process of the lottery. Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves had made up the slips of paper and put them in the box. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. And you get the list, and there's 200 or 300 people in the village, this sort of small town. And part of what is happening is this sort of power of small town, and everybody in town knowing each other. And that's part of that closeness and intimacy of this small town is, again, everybody just keeps doing the same thing and doesn't question tradition. And then the person who eventually gets killed finally shows up in the story. Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, clean forgot what day it was. And you get this sort of, it's not quite irony, but there is this symbolic power of she forgets about the lottery, but the lottery hasn't forgotten about her, and it gets her in the end. Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. And you see her coming through there. Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson. And she finally gets up there. And also notably, when she first shows up in the story, she's not worried about the lottery. She's not stressed out. It's almost like she's laughing and joking with her friends, which is definitely not the attitude she's going to have at the end of the lottery. And they go through the rules of the lottery here. Wife draws for the husband and all that kind of stuff. And you got to be 17 or 18. You got to be legally an adult to draw. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat. "Already," he called. "I'll read the names, heads of family." And they get the lottery going. You get the process of the lottery. Allen, Anderson, Bentham, and they're just going through the names. And you still haven't really found out what's going to happen at the lottery. And Mrs. Hutchinson still joking around. "Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. Right below that is where Old Man Warner snorted, "Pack of crazy fools." Over in the North Village, they're talking of giving up the lottery, and Old Man Warner speaks up, the voice of tradition, the voice of, the voice of the oldest person in the village. Listening to young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly, pack of young fools. Somebody tries to bring up giving up the lottery, not doing this anymore. And the old man voice of tradition is like, no, 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 that's crazy. We got to keep doing things the way we've always done them. And then, of course, after that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, all right, fellows. And there is this mystery of who's got the black dot, who's going to die. It's Hutchinson, it's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. And so you have this double process where the head of the family gets the black dot. Then they have to draw again to find out who in the family is going to get killed. This is where Mrs. Hutchinson starts to complain, too. This is where her attitude finally changes. You didn't give him time enough to take any papers he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Multiple times from this point on, she's like, this isn't fair. It isn't right. We're not doing things fairly. They go through it. Here's another. It wasn't fair, Tessie said. And they make Mr. and Mrs. Hutchinson and their 3 kids draw again. Mrs. Hutchinson gets the black dot folded. It's not the way it used to be, Old Man Warner said clearly. People ain't the way they used to be. Again, this sort of old man, stereotypical old man, voice of tradition, change is bad kind of thing. And then you find out it's Tessie, Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. Show us her paper, Bill. Bill went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of his hand. And then here you get to the ending. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now. She held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. It isn't fair, she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Here's the rocks that showed up right at the beginning of the story. Now you find out what they were really for. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone. Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. It isn't fair. It isn't right, Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. Well, she didn't care about that until it was her getting hurt, getting care. She never questioned this tradition until it was personal for her. It isn't fair. It isn't right, Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. That's the end of this story. And sometimes when I teach this story, students are like, why does the story end here? Why don't we get to see her killed? And I always think, you don't need to see her killed. You know what's coming next. Like somebody's getting hit in the head with rocks. You know she won. They've got the rocks. You know what's coming. You don't need to graphically see it because you know what's about to happen. They're about to stone her to death. So what you get is these people behaving in this extreme, out of the norm way. This is either one of the kinds of grotesque, these normal people behaving in an extreme way because of this unique situation, their tradition of killing somebody in this village, or just normal people. So is it the people who are doing this, or is it the situation that just forces these people into? And that's one of the problems, this story raises is normal people will, for whatever reason, get them in a big crowd and give them a reason, and they will behave in these extreme ways. In this case, the reason for that the story gives you is it's this tradition, and nobody questions it. Everybody just jumps into this mob attitude and is like, this is how we've always done things, and today's the day we kill somebody. And so what this story gives you is this grotesque, following of tradition, this sort of unquestioning, we can't change the box, we've all got to just do this because it's what we've always done. And there is obviously the irony of, like I said, you think winning the lottery is a good thing, but obviously at the end of this story you find out it's a bad thing. So this story gives you the foreshadowing with the rocks, the situational irony with the lottery. You think it's going to be good, you expect it to be good, and then it turns out to be bad, the worst kind of bad, because somebody gets murdered. And there is also that sort of change in Miss Hutchinson from ha, this is so funny, I'm sorry I was running late, to it's not fair, it's not right, and then they kill her. That's really, I think Shirley Jackson would say the grotesqueness in this story is not the murder, it's the unquestioning following of the tradition by these people, because that's the real root cause of what causes them to behave in this extreme way. If you've got questions, Shirley Jackson is dead now. She died in 1965, so she's been gone for years. This story, though, has stayed in American literature. It's one of the most famous stories in American literature. I think because of this sort of the way that it so effectively depicts like blindly following tradition and mob violence and that kind of stuff. If you've got questions about Shirley Jackson or about this story, just be in touch. Otherwise, I hope it helps you understand it and helps you understand how it fits in the Gothic and grotesque module. Thanks, everybody.